In 2016, a climber vanished high on Mount Everest. 1 year later, his wife found his ice axe, and beneath it, a voice recorder. Her name was Sarah. His name was Mark. He had gone to the mountain with a smile that felt, in memory, too bright, too confident. He was an experienced climber, not a reckless man, but Everest was different. Everest was a titan, indifferent to skill, indifferent to love, indifferent to the lives waiting at its base. When the satellite phone went silent, Sarah had known, with a certainty that chilled her deeper than any winter, that something was terribly wrong. Mark was religious about his check-ins. Every 12 hours, a brief call, a reassurance. The first missed call was a knot in her stomach. The second, a cold dread spreading through her veins. By the third, the silence from the mountain was a roar in her ears. The news came in fragments, relayed by the expedition company, then by consular officials. A storm had hit his section of the mountain. Unexpected. Vicious. Mark had been ascending solo on a less common route, aiming for a late-season summit when the crowds were thinner. He was above Camp 4, in the death zone, when his signal and his life apparently winked out. The search began within hours. Helicopters, when the weather cleared enough for them to even attempt flight, scanned the dizzying white expanse. Teams of Sherpas, men who knew the mountain like their own bodies, pushed upwards, braving the same lethal conditions that had likely claimed Mark. They searched for days, then weeks. They found nothing. No footprints swallowed by new snow, no discarded glove, no sign of a fall, no flicker of color against the monochrome landscape of rock and ice. It was as if the mountain had simply inhaled him. Sarah flew to Kathmandu, a ghost in her own life, moving through the motions of a nightmare. She met the search leaders, saw the strain in their eyes, the pity they tried to hide. They spoke of the mountain's power, of sudden avalanches, of hidden crevasses that could swallow a man whole, leaving no trace. They spoke of winds that could scour the slopes clean. They were kind, in a distant professional way. They told her, gently, that hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. After 3 weeks, the official search was called off. Resources were limited. The mountain was too perilous. Mark was presumed lost. Another life, claimed by Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world. She returned to their quiet house, a house that still echoed with his laughter, his energy. His climbing gear lay in the spare room, meticulously organized, waiting for a journey he would never complete. His books on mountaineering filled the shelves, pages dog-eared, notes scribbled in the margins. Each object was a torment, a reminder. The world kept spinning. Friends offered condolences. Then, after a while, awkward silences. They wanted her to grieve, to accept, to move on. How could she move on when she didn't know what she was moving on from? Without a body, without a last word, without any certainty, Mark was simply gone, erased. The first few months were a blur of numb disbelief. She would wake up expecting to find him beside her. Then the cold reality would crash down. She replayed their last conversation 1,000 times. His voice, crackling over the satellite connection, full of excitement about the good weather window, the progress he was making. He'd told her he loved her. He'd promised to be careful. Had he been? Or had carefulness not been enough? Sleep offered little escape. Dreams of Mark, sometimes vivid and happy, sometimes terrifying, him calling her name from a vast, empty whiteness. She'd wake with a gasp, her heart pounding, the desolation of his absence settling over her like a physical weight. She lost weight. The vibrant woman Mark had loved began to fade, replaced by a pale, haunted version of herself. Then, slowly, something else began to stir beneath the grief. A refusal, A stubborn, burning refusal to let Mark be just a name on a list of Everest's victims. If the mountain wouldn't give him back, if the experts couldn't find him, then she would. The idea started as a whisper, a desperate, irrational thought. It grew louder, more insistent. She knew nothing about high-altitude climbing, nothing about Everest beyond Mark's stories and the grim news reports. But she knew Mark. She knew his habits, his way of thinking. Maybe, just maybe, she could find something everyone else had missed. She began to study. His maps, spread across the dining room table, became her new world. She traced his intended route, then scoured his journals for any mention of alternatives, escape paths, emergency shelters he might have considered. She read every book he owned on Everest, every account of survival and tragedy on its slopes. She learned about the Khumbu Icefall, the Lhotse Face, the Yellow Band, the Balcony, the Hillary Step. The names became familiar, like stations on a tragic pilgrimage. She researched the storm that had hit his ascent window, tracking its path, its intensity. One entry in his journal, made weeks before he left, caught her eye. He described a conversation with an old Sherpa in Namche Bazaar about a rarely used shepherd's trail that led to a series of high yak pastures, far off the main climbing routes but potentially offering a desperate, unconventional descent path from a particular section of his planned ascent if he were cut off by an avalanche further up. It was a long shot, a footnote in his meticulous planning, but it was something, a flicker of possibility in the overwhelming darkness. Friends and family were aghast when she finally voiced her intention. They called it madness, a suicide mission. They begged her to reconsider, to accept the inevitable. Her mother cried. Her sister pleaded. But their words couldn't penetrate the shield of her resolve. This wasn't about acceptance. It was about a search, a final one. She wasn't a mountaineer, but she was Mark's wife. And she had to try. If he was up there, she couldn't leave him alone. If there was even the smallest piece of him to find, a button, a shred of fabric, a final message scratched into a rock, she needed to find it. The year that followed his disappearance was a year of relentless preparation. She sold her car, cashed in her savings. She took unpaid leave from her job, a job that now felt meaningless. She found a trainer, a former climber, who looked at her with pity but agreed to help her achieve the peak physical fitness required just to reach base camp, and perhaps slightly beyond, into the lower, safer reaches of Mark's route. She trekked for hours, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, pushing herself to limits she hadn't known she possessed. She learned about altitude sickness, frostbite, hypothermia. She learned about the gear, the logistics, the sheer brutal cost of even setting foot on Everest's sacred ground. She found a small, local trekking company in Kathmandu run by a man named Dorje, whose brother had been one of the Sherpas on the initial, fruitless search for Mark. Dorje was hesitant. He remembered the despair of that search. He told her the mountain had already taken too much. He didn't want to be responsible for more heartbreak. But Sarah's quiet determination, the desperate plea in her eyes, eventually wore him down. He agreed to arrange a permit for her to trek to base camp and to assign a guide, an experienced Sherpa named Pemba, to accompany her as far as was safely possible, to help her explore the lower sections of Mark's route, and perhaps the area near those shepherd's trails Mark had noted. Pemba had also been part of the original search. He knew the terrain. He knew the risks. As the anniversary of Mark's disappearance approached, Sarah packed her bags, not the vibrant clothes of a tourist, but practical warm layers. She packed Mark's photograph. She packed a small, worn teddy bear he'd won for her at a fair years ago, a silly, sentimental thing that now felt like a lifeline. She stood in their bedroom, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. On his side of the bed, his old faded map of the Everest region lay open. Her finger traced the complex web of contour lines, the blue glaciers, the stark peaks. She traced the route he had planned, then the faint, almost invisible line he'd penciled in towards those high pastures. Her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the stillness of the empty room. "I'm coming, Mark. I'm coming to find you." The mountain had kept its silence for a year. Now, she would go and ask her questions directly. She knew, deep down, that the answers might destroy her, but the not knowing, that was a slow, relentless erosion of her soul, and that she could no longer bear. The flight into Lukla was terrifying. The tiny airstrip, perched on the side of a mountain, seemed impossibly short, a mere ribbon of asphalt ending in a sheer drop. Sarah gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, as the small plane bucked and swayed through the turbulent Himalayan air. When they landed, with a jarring thud that threw her forward against her seatbelt, a wave of relief washed over her, quickly followed by a fresh surge of anxiety. This was it. The gateway to the Khumbu Valley, the path to Everest. Pemba met her at the tiny airport. He was a short, powerfully built man, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes dark and watchful. He greeted her with a polite nod, his expression unreadable. He spoke little, his English functional but sparse. He shouldered her heaviest bag with an ease that belied its weight and led her into the bustling, chaotic village of Lukla. The air was thin here, already noticeably different from Kathmandu. The sounds were of yak bells, prayer wheels spinning, the chatter of trekkers and porters. And above it all, the silent, beckoning presence of the great peaks, still hidden by the lower mountains but felt an immense pressure in the atmosphere. The first few days of the trek were a brutal awakening. The trails were steep, rocky, and relentless. Each step was an effort, her lungs straining in the thinning air, her city's soft muscles protesting with every incline. Pemba moved with a steady, unhurried pace, never seeming to tire, always waiting patiently for her to catch up. He taught her to walk slowly, to breathe deeply, to drink endless cups of tea. He pointed out the names of the mountains that began to reveal themselves, jagged snow-capped giants against the piercing blue sky. Amadablam, Thamserku, Kangtega, beautiful, but terrifying in their scale. They passed through picturesque Sherpa villages, prayer flags fluttering in the wind, mani stones carved with intricate mantras lining the paths. Children with bright eyes and rosy cheeks would call out, "Namaste," as she passed. For brief moments, Sarah would feel a sense of peace, a connection to this ancient land and its resilient people. Then the thought of Mark would return, a sharp ache in her chest, and the beauty around her would seem like a cruel mockery. He had walked this path, seen these same sights, full of hope and anticipation. Where had it all gone so wrong? As they gained altitude, the landscape became harsher, more barren. The lush forests gave way to scrubland, then to rock and ice. The nights grew colder, the silence more profound. Sarah found herself retreating further into her own thoughts. The conversations with Pemba, minimal, functional. He was a guide, not a confidant. He was there to keep her safe, to lead her along the trail. He wasn't there to share her grief. One evening, in the small village of Dingbosch, as they sat huddled around the smoky stove in a tea-house common room, Pemba spoke, his voice quiet. He said, "Your husband, Mark, he was a strong climber, very skilled. I was on the search. We looked everywhere. The mountain, sometimes, it just takes them." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. It was the first time he'd directly mentioned Mark in such a personal way. She wanted to ask him more, to hear every detail of the search, but she couldn't bring herself to form the words. The pain was too raw. Pemba seemed to understand. He added, "This place, it demands respect. We must be careful." Sarah looked at him, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time. She saw not just a guide, but a man who lived in the shadow of this colossal, dangerous beauty every day of his life. A man who had seen too much loss. "I will be," she promised, her voice hoarse. "I just need to see." The acclimatization days were crucial. They would trek high, then descend to sleep lower, allowing her body to adjust to the crippling lack of oxygen. Each ascent was a fresh torture, her head throbbing, her stomach churning. But with each small victory, each higher pass reached, a tiny spark of something fierce and determined grew within her. She was doing this. She was walking towards him. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of arduous trekking, they rounded a bend in the trail, and there it was. Everest, Nuptse, Hotse. The iconic trio, a colossal wall of rock and ice dominating the skyline. It didn't look real. It was too vast, too majestic, too terrifying. Sarah stopped, her breath catching in her throat, not just from the altitude, but from the sheer, overwhelming power emanating from the scene before her. The summit of Everest, a distant plume of snow blowing from its peak, seemed to scrape the roof of the world. This was the mountain that had taken Mark. This was the beautiful, terrible place where he had vanished. Tears welled in her eyes, freezing instantly on her cheeks in the biting wind. Pemba stood beside her, silent, allowing her the moment. He had seen this reaction many times before, from those who came to worship and those who came to mourn. He placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Base camp is close now," he said. "We rest there. Then, we see." Sarah nodded, wiping her frozen tears with a gloved hand. She looked up at the summit, a tiny, insignificant human, at the foot of a god. She had come so far. But the real journey, the heart of her search, was only just beginning, and it would take her into places far darker and more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The mountain loomed, impassive, its secrets locked tight in its icy embrace. Everest Base Camp was a sprawling, temporary city of brightly colored tents pitched on the rubble-strewn surface of the Khumbu Glacier. It was a place of stark contrasts, bustling with life, yet shadowed by the ever-present threat of death from the colossal peaks towering above. The air thrummed with a strange energy, a mixture of excitement, ambition, fear, and the grinding day-to-day reality of existing in one of the world's most extreme environments. Trekkers like herself mingled with serious climbing expeditions preparing for their summit bids. The glacier groaned and creaked beneath their feet, a living, moving river of ice. Pemba secured a small tent for her in a quieter section of the camp, away from the main thoroughfares. He seemed to know everyone, exchanging quiet greetings with other Sherpas, his presence commanding a subtle respect. He warned Sarah about the dangers even within base camp, hidden crevasses in the glacier, the risk of rockfall from the surrounding slopes, the ever-present threat of altitude sickness. He told her to rest, to acclimatize further. The real search, he said, could only begin when she was stronger, when the weather offered a window. The days at base camp passed in a strange haze. Sarah tried to follow Pemba's advice, resting, drinking fluids, taking short walks to aid her acclimatization. But her mind was restless, her gaze constantly drawn upwards to the Khumbu icefall, the first great obstacle on the route to the summit, a chaotic, ever-shifting labyrinth of seracs and crevasses. Mark had passed through there. He had navigated its treacherous beauty. Had he felt fear, or only the thrill of the challenge? She met other climbers, heard their stories of past expeditions, their hopes for the current season. Some were veterans, their faces etched with the memory of storms and summits. Others were novices, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. She listened, but rarely spoke of her own purpose. It felt too private, too raw, to share with these strangers, however well-intentioned they might be. Pemba, true to his word, began to make inquiries. He spoke with other Sherpas who had been on the mountain the previous year, during the period Mark had disappeared. He asked about unusual weather patterns, about any unconfirmed sightings, any whispers or rumors that might have been dismissed at the time. Most shook their heads. The storm had been sudden and severe. Many climbers had been forced to retreat or shelter. In the chaos, one solo climber, on a less traveled route, could easily be overlooked, his absence not noted until it was too late. One elderly Sherpa, a man named Ang Tsering, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the mountains themselves, listened patiently to Pemba's questions. He had been at Camp 2 when the storm hit. He remembered the ferocity of the wind, the whiteout conditions that had lasted for nearly 2 days. He said, many prayers were said. The mountain was angry that week. He looked at Sarah, his gaze penetrating. He said, sometimes it is better to let the mountain keep what it takes. To disturb the spirits, it is not always wise. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezing air, but his words, meant perhaps as a gentle warning, only solidified her resolve. She wasn't here to disturb spirits. She was here to find her husband. After a week at base camp, Pemba deemed her ready to venture slightly higher. He was still cautious, emphasizing that they would not, under any circumstances, enter the icefall itself. It was far too dangerous for an inexperienced trekker. But they could explore the lower approaches, the areas where Mark might have made his final preparations, or where debris from higher up might conceivably have been washed down or blown by the wind. And, crucially, they could begin to head in the direction of the high pastures Mark had mentioned in his journal, the area that had become the focal point of Sarah's desperate hope. Their first excursions were short, tentative probes onto the edges of the glacier, towards the chaotic jumble of ice that marked the entrance to the icefall. The scale was deceptive. What looked like small blocks of ice from base camp were the size of houses, teetering precariously, ready to collapse at any moment. The sound of distant avalanches was a constant rumble, a reminder of the mountain's restless power. Sarah scanned every rock, every patch of snow, every shadow, searching for any sign, any anomaly, a piece of fabric, a glint of metal, anything that didn't belong to the natural landscape. She found nothing but ice, rock, and the discarded remnants of past expeditions, an old oxygen bottle, a tattered piece of rope, a faded food wrapper. Each find was a small, sharp disappointment. Pemba watched her patiently, his own eyes scanning the terrain with unpracticed efficiency. He rarely offered comment, unless it was to point out a potential hazard, a hidden crevasse, an unstable slope. He seemed to understand her need to do this, even if he didn't share her hope. Days turned into a week, then 2. The weather held, a rare period of stability. They ventured further afield, always staying on the fringes of the main climbing routes, exploring gullies and moraines that were rarely visited. Sarah showed Pemba the notes from Mark's journal, the rough sketch he'd made of the possible route to the shepherd's trails. Pemba studied it intently. He knew the area, though he said it was not a place climbers ever went. It was difficult terrain, broken, and led away from the summit, not towards it. But he agreed it was plausible that a climber in distress, cut off from the main route and disoriented by a storm, might head in that direction, perhaps mistaking it for a descent path. Their search shifted focus. They began to contour along the lower flanks of Nuptse, heading towards the remote valley Mark had identified. The going was tough, far more challenging than the well-trodden trail to base camp. There were no paths here, only loose scree, treacherous ice patches, and dense thickets of rhododendron and juniper at the lower elevations. Sarah fell often, her hands and knees scraped and bruised. But she pushed on, driven by a relentless energy that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. Pemba was always there, steady and supportive, choosing the safest lines, offering a hand when she stumbled. He taught her to read the snow, to listen to the wind. He showed her the tracks of blue sheep, the distant silhouette of a Himalayan tar perched on a crag. He shared his meager lunch with her, dried sampa, hard cheese, and sweet tea from his thermos. In their shared silence, a fragile bond began to form, a bond forged in the crucible of this harsh landscape, and their unspoken, shared understanding of loss. One afternoon, as they were traversing a steep, snow-filled gully, Pemba suddenly stopped. He pointed, up there. Sarah followed his gaze. High above them, on a narrow, windswept ridge, was a splash of color. Red. Faded, tattered, but unmistakably the remnants of prayer flags wrapped around what looked like a broken pole. It was directly on the line Mark had sketched in his journal. Her heart leaped. Prayer flags were common, but this location, so remote, so specific to Mark's note, it felt significant. "It is a small pass," Pemba said. "Shepherds sometimes use it. Long ago. Not now. Too dangerous." "Could we reach it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Pemba looked up at the sky. The clouds were gathering, the wind picking up. "Tomorrow," he said. "If the weather is good. Today, we go back. It is too late." Sarah wanted to argue, to push on, but she knew he was right. The mountains demanded patience, respect. To rush, to be reckless, was to invite disaster. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on that distant splash of red. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker, not of hope, because hope was too fragile, too easily crushed, but of something else, a sense of direction. A feeling that she was, at last, truly on Mark's trail. The mountain was still silent, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was beginning to offer up a clue. That night, sleep was a long time coming, her mind racing with possibilities, with the image of those tattered flags, a lonely sentinel on a forgotten pass. The weather held. The next morning, under a clear, cold sky, they set out before dawn, their headlamps cutting cones of light in the darkness. The ascent towards the pass was arduous, a relentless climb over loose rock and steep, icy snowfields. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the ridge above, on that small, faded patch of red that seemed to grow agonizingly slowly as they gained height. Pemba moved with his usual quiet efficiency, kicking steps in the snow, testing each handhold, his senses alert to any sign of danger. He didn't speak, conserving his energy, and Sarah followed his example, her mind a whirlwind of anticipation and dread. What would they find? Would it be another dead end, another crushing disappointment? Or would this, finally, be the place where Mark's trail became clear? After what felt like an eternity, they reached the crest of the ridge. The wind hit them with full force, raw and biting, carrying fine particles of ice that stung Sarah's exposed skin. She staggered, bracing herself against the gale, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged gasps. The prayer flags were even more tattered up close, faded to pale pinks and oranges, shredded by years of wind and weather. They were wrapped around a short, thick wooden pole that had indeed snapped, its upper half lying forlornly in the snow a few feet away. It looked like it had been there for a very long time. Perhaps Mark had only noted it as a landmark. Sarah's heart sank. It was just an old, forgotten shrine. Nothing more. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over her. She had built this up so much in her mind. Pemba was already scanning the small, desolate area of the pass. It was no more than a few yards wide, a dip in the ridge before the land fell away steeply on the other side. He poked at the snow with his ice axe, his expression grim. Nothing. Sarah walked slowly towards the broken pole. She touched the tattered flags, their fabric stiff with ice. She closed her eyes. A silent prayer, a desperate plea to Mark, to whatever spirits might inhabit this lonely place. Where are you? She opened her eyes and looked down. The snow around the base of the standing part of the pole was drifted, sculpted by the wind into strange shapes. But there was something not quite right about one of the drifts, just behind the pole, almost hidden by it. A slight, unnatural concavity. She knelt, her knees sinking into the cold snow. She reached out a gloved hand and brushed away the top layer of powder. Her fingers touched something hard, metallic. Her breath caught. With frantic movements, she scraped away more snow. The metallic object resolved itself into a dull gray point, then a shaft, an ice axe. Not new and gleaming, but weathered, scarred. An ice axe, half buried, angled downwards as if plunged into the snow for support, or as a marker. Pemba, seeing her sudden, intense focus, came over. He knelt beside her. His eyes widened. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely function. She knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones, even before she fully uncovered it. She recognized the make, the custom grip tape Mark had insisted on using, now faded and worn. It was Mark's ice axe. A sob escaped her, a raw, animal sound torn from the depths of her grief, and a sudden, terrifying surge of something akin to hope. He had been here. This was real. This was his. Pemba placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His voice was gentle. "Easy, Sarah. Easy." But Sarah was barely listening. Her eyes were fixed on the spot where the ice axe entered the snow. If his axe was here, what else? She dug deeper, her fingers numb with cold but driven by a desperate urgency. The snow was compacted beneath the axe, as if protecting something. And then she saw it, a small, dark rectangle, nestled directly under the buried head of the ice axe. It was wrapped in thick, clear plastic, sealed with what looked like duct tape. A voice recorder. The world seemed to tilt. The wind, the cold, the towering peaks around them all faded into insignificance. There was only this small, plastic-wrapped object in her hands, Mark's ice axe. And beneath it, a message? A testament? His last words? Tears were streaming down her face now, freezing on her cheeks. But she didn't feel them. She looked at Pemba, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a wild, uncontainable elation. He was looking at the recorder with a stunned, somber expression. The mountain had finally yielded a secret. A small, terrible, precious secret. What answers, or what new horrors, did it hold? The weight of it in her hands felt immense, heavier than any stone. The journey to this desolate pass had been brutal. But Sarah knew, with chilling certainty, that the journey into the contents of that small recorder would be infinitely harder. The descent from the pass was a blur. Sarah clutched the voice recorder to her chest, inside her down jacket, protecting it as if it were a fragile, beating heart. Mark's ice axe, Pemba carried, strapped to his pack. The wind howled around them, seeming to mock the fragile discovery they had made. Each step downwards was treacherous, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling. What was on that tape? The question hammered at her with every beat of her pulse. Pemba was quiet, his earlier stoicism replaced by a deep solemnity. He understood the gravity of what they had found. He had seen death on the mountain many times, but this felt different. This was a voice from the void, a message brought back from a place no one was meant to return from. He guided Sarah with extra care, his concern for her palpable. He knew that whatever was on that recorder, it would change her forever. They didn't dare try to play it on the exposed ridge, or even during the hasty breaks they took on the way down. The delicate electronics, if they still worked after a year in the ice, needed a sheltered environment, steady hands. The anticipation was a torment. Sarah felt like she was carrying a bomb, ticking silently, ready to explode and shatter the fragile composure she had struggled so hard to maintain. It was late afternoon when they finally stumbled back into the relative safety of their small camp, a few hours below the pass. They had pushed themselves hard, driven by the need to get to a place where they could confront the contents of the recorder. Sarah's tent felt like a sanctuary, a tiny pocket of stillness in the overwhelming vastness of the Himalayas. Pemba helped her light the small stove, his movements economical and precise. He boiled water for tea, his presence a comforting, grounding force. He didn't press her. He simply waited, his dark eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Sarah's hands were still shaking as she carefully unwrapped the plastic from the recorder. The duct tape was brittle with cold, and it took her several agonizing minutes to peel it away without damaging the casing. The recorder itself was a small, robust model, designed for outdoor use. Mark had always favored practical, durable gear. There was a thin layer of frost on its surface, which she gently wiped away. She fumbled with the battery compartment. "Please," she whispered, "please work. The original batteries would surely be dead." She had brought spares, the same type Mark used, a detail she'd meticulously researched from his gear lists. With trembling fingers, she inserted the new batteries. For a moment, nothing. Her heart plummeted. Had it all been for nothing? Was the device ruined by a year of extreme cold, of being buried in snow and ice? Then, a tiny red light flickered on. The display miraculously lit up, showing a series of numbers. It worked. Sarah let out a shaky breath. She looked at Pemba. He nodded slowly, his expression encouraging. She pressed the play button. At first, there was only static, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to fill the tiny tent. Sarah's hope wavered. Then, through the static, a sound. Wind. A howling, ferocious wind, so real it felt, as if it was tearing at the fabric of their tent. And then, a voice. Mark's voice. Strained, breathless, a little tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakably his. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled instantly, blurring her vision. It was him. After a year of silence, of aching emptiness, here he was, speaking to her. Day 3 of the storm, I think. His voice was raspy, weak. The wind noise was overpowering at times, making it hard to catch every word. Visibility 0. Complete whiteout for God. Feels like forever. Tried to dig in. Snow cave. Not deep enough. Constantly filling in. He coughed, a dry, racking sound that tore at Sarah's heart. Lost the route. Completely. Should have turned back sooner. Arrogance. Stupid. The summit. It wasn't worth this. His voice was laced with a bitter self-recrimination. Sarah was crying freely now, silent tears streaming down her face. Pemba sat motionless, his head bowed slightly, listening. Food is low, Mark continued, his words punctuated by gasps for air. The altitude, the exertion, the cold, all evident in his struggle to speak. Water, melting snow, takes so much fuel. Fuel's almost gone. There was a long pause, filled only by the relentless shriek of the wind on the recording. Sarah held her breath. I'm in a bad place, real bad. Don't know which way is down anymore. Everything looks the same, just white. Endless white. He sounded utterly defeated, the usual strength and confidence in his voice completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. Sarah reached out, her fingers touching the cold plastic of the recorder, as if she could somehow reach through it, touch him, offer comfort. Sarah, he whispered her name, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her, so intense, it almost buckled her. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have listened, stayed home, with you. His voice broke. Another fit of coughing. Then, a chilling change in his tone. It's not just the storm, he said, his voice dropping, conspiratorial, almost a whisper beneath the wind. I thought I was imagining it at first. The altitude, tricks your mind. Sarah frowned, leaning closer to the speaker. What was he talking about? But I saw it again. Yesterday. And this morning, when the wind dropped for a few minutes. Another pause. The wind on the tape seemed to howl louder. There's something else out here. His voice was tight with a new kind of fear. Something beyond the struggle for survival. I don't know what it is, but it's watching me. Sarah's blood ran cold. She exchanged a wide-eyed, terrified glance with Pemba. His usual calm expression was gone, replaced by one of deep unease. What had Mark seen? Or what had he thought he'd seen, in his desperate, hypoxic state? The recording continued, and with every word, the warmth of the small tent seemed to leach away, replaced by an icy dread that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The mountain had given them Mark's voice, but it was also beginning to share his terror. The tent felt suddenly smaller, the canvas walls too thin against the immensity of the surrounding peaks and the chilling words coming from the small recorder. Mark's voice, raw with exhaustion and a dawning bewildered terror, filled the suffocating silence between his recorded gasps and the relentless shriek of the wind. It's a shadow, he stammered, his breath rasping. On the ridge. Sometimes it's on the ridge parallel to mine, just moving, keeping pace. Sarah strained to hear, her entire being focused on his words. A shadow? What did he mean? Another climber? Too big, Mark continued, as if sensing her unspoken question. And too fast. The way it moves, it's not human, not in this terrain, not in this storm. His voice was a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. I shouted. Yesterday, when I first saw it clearly, or thought I did. No reply, just gone, melted into the white. Pemba shifted uneasily beside Sarah. He had heard tales, of course. Old Sherpa legends, stories whispered around campfires, of spirits and entities that roamed the high peaks, the Yeti being the most famous, but also darker, more amorphous beings, protectors or demons of the mountain, depending on the teller. He had always dismissed them as folklore, the product of altitude-addled minds or too much Chang. But hearing the conviction, the sheer terror in this dying climber's voice, it sent a shiver down his spine. I told myself it was the mountain playing tricks, Mark's voice went on, weaker now. Hypoxia. Hallucinations. God, I hope it's hallucinations. But there was no hope in his tone. Only a deepening dread, but it feels real. It feels like it's hunting. Hunting? Sarah's hand tightened on the recorder. This was veering into a realm of terror she hadn't been prepared for. An accident, a misstep, succumbing to the elements. Those were tragedies she could, perhaps, eventually comprehend. But this? Being stalked? "I've been trying to move when the wind eases a little," Mark said, his words becoming more fragmented. "Change direction. But it finds me. Always. This morning, I saw it closer. Just for a second. The cloud lifted. It was just across this gully. Dark. No features. Just a shape." And then the snow closed in again. He let out a shaky, desperate laugh that held no humor. "Maybe I'm going mad. Maybe I already am. It's so cold. So damn cold." Sarah could hear his teeth chattering on the recording. She felt an overwhelming urge to cradle the recorder, to somehow warm him, protect him from the spectral thing he described. "Tried to use the radio again," he said, his voice barely audible over a sudden squall of wind on the tape. "Nothing. Just static. Battery's almost dead anyway. Like everything else." There was a long silence, punctuated only by his ragged breathing and the incessant wind. Sarah waited, her heart pounding, every nerve stretched taut. Was that it? Was it over? Then, his voice again, so faint she had to press her ear almost against the speaker. "It's been days now. Or maybe it's all one long day, I don't know. Time doesn't mean anything up here." He coughed, a weak, painful sound. "I see it, even when I close my eyes now. Just waiting, out there in the white. Or maybe it's in my head. I don't know what's real anymore." His despair was a physical thing, reaching out from the small device, filling the tent, chilling Sarah to the bone. This wasn't just a record of a man dying from the elements. It was a record of a mind unraveling under an unimaginable pressure, tormented by something he couldn't understand, something he couldn't fight. "The ice axe," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Left it. At the pass. The little one. With the prayer flags. If anyone finds this, find me. Near there. Tried to get back, but too weak." So he had made it to the pass, left the axe and the recorder, and then tried to continue. Or perhaps he'd returned to that spot, sensing the end was near, wanting to leave his testament where it might be found. "It's quiet now," he whispered. The wind on the recording had indeed subsided slightly, or perhaps he had found a more sheltered spot. "The wind has dropped for a moment. It's so still and cold." Another long pause. Sarah found herself holding her breath, dreading what might come next, yet desperate to hear it. "I can see my breath," he said, a strange, detached quality to his voice. "Little clouds, disappearing, like me." He was fading. Sarah knew it. She could hear the life draining out of him, word by painful word. It's not the cold that scares me anymore," he said, his voice suddenly a little clearer, imbued with a chilling resignation. "Or the storm, or even dying." A final, shuddering breath. "It's what's watching me from the ridge." The words hung in the air, stark, terrifying. Then a click. Silence. The recording ended. For a long moment, Sarah and Pemba sat frozen, the only sound the gentle hiss of their small stove and Sarah's own ragged breathing. The finality of it, the sheer horror of Mark's last articulated fear, was overwhelming. It wasn't an accident. Not entirely. It was a struggle against the elements, yes, but also against something else. Something unseen, unknown, that had broken his spirit before the mountain finally claimed his body. Sarah slowly lowered the recorder. Her face was ashen. The tears had stopped, replaced by a look of stunned, hollow-eyed shock. What had happened after that final, chilling sentence? Had the shadow approached? Or had Mark simply succumbed to the cold, his mind filled with terrifying images, real or imagined. The recorder offered no more answers. Only that last, dreadful pronouncement. Pemba finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. "Spirits of the mountain, they are not to be trifled with." He wasn't looking at Sarah, but at the tent wall, as if seeing something beyond it. He saw something, or he believed he did. In the end, it is the same. Sarah shook her head, though whether in denial or confusion she couldn't have said. "But what was it, Pemba? What could it have been?" Pemba sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Who can say? The mountain is vast. It holds many secrets. Some climbers, when the altitude sickness takes them, their minds, they see things. Terrible things. Sometimes there are stories, old stories." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. Mark might have been a victim of his own oxygen-starved brain. Or he might have encountered something truly inexplicable, something that belonged to the high, lonely places of the world, something ancient and perhaps malevolent. The ambiguity was almost worse than a straightforward account of an accident. It left room for endless, agonizing speculation. It painted Mark's final hours not just as a tragic struggle against nature, but as a descent into a psychological horror show, alone, terrified, and hunted. Sarah picked up the recorder again, turning it over and over in her numb fingers. This small device held her husband's last thoughts, his final terror. It was an unbearable burden, yet an infinitely precious connection to him. She had come to Everest seeking answers, and in a way, she had found them. She knew now that he hadn't died quickly. He had suffered. He had been afraid. And he had not been alone in his final moments, though the company he kept was the stuff of nightmares. The light outside the tent was fading. The deep Himalayan twilight was settling over the mountains, bringing with it an even more profound cold. Sarah shivered, though not just from the dropping temperature. The warmth and comfort of the small tent felt like a fragile illusion, easily pierced by the horrors the recorder had unleashed. What now? What did she do with this terrible knowledge? Pemba was watching her, his expression a mixture of pity and concern. "We should descend tomorrow, Sarah," he said gently. "Early. There is nothing more for us here. You have what you came for." Did she? She had his ice axe. She had his voice. But she didn't have him. And the peace, the closure she had so desperately sought, felt further away than ever. Instead, she had a new, haunting image to carry with her. Mark, alone in the blinding snow, watching a shadow on the ridge, a shadow that watched him back. The mountain had not just taken his life, it had stolen his sanity, his peace, even in death. And a part of Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that the shadow would now, in a way, watch her too, for the rest of her days. The descent from the high camp was somber. Every rock, every gust of wind, every fleeting shadow seemed to hold a new menace. Sarah walked like an automaton, her body moving, but her mind trapped in the echoing horror of Mark's last words. Pemba stayed close, his quiet presence a small anchor in the storm of her emotions. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight of what she carried. Not just the physical objects, the ice axe and the recorder, but the invisible burden of Mark's terror. They spoke little. What was there to say? The recording had laid bare a horror that defied easy explanation, a horror that lingered in the thin, cold air between them. Sarah found herself scanning the high ridges, her eyes searching the vast, empty landscapes, half expecting to see a flicker of movement, a dark shape against the snow. She saw nothing, of course, only the indifferent majesty of the mountains. But the feeling of being watched, the chilling empathy for Mark's final ordeal, settled deep within her. Reaching base camp felt like returning to a different world, a world of noise and people and the mundane routines of expedition life. But it was a world Sarah no longer fully belonged to. She had been to a place, emotionally and physically, that few could comprehend. She carried a secret, a terrible knowledge that set her apart. She informed Dorje, the trekking company owner, about their find. She played him a small portion of the recording, enough for him to understand the gist. His reaction was one of profound shock and a deep, traditional Sherpa reverence for the mysteries of the mountain. He agreed that the authorities needed to be informed, but he also cautioned her. Such stories, they were often dismissed by outsiders. The official cause of Mark's death would likely remain misadventure or exposure. The shadow on the ridge would not find its way into any official report. And so it was. Back in Kathmandu, Sarah met with the consular officials again. She handed over the ice axe and the voice recorder. She told them what she had found, what Mark had said. They listened politely, their faces carefully neutral. They took notes. They expressed their condolences. Again, they promised to add the items to Mark's file. The case, they gently implied, was closed. Another Everest tragedy with a few more poignant details. They offered to arrange grief counseling. Sarah knew they didn't believe the part about the shadow. Or, if they did, they attributed it to altitude-induced psychosis. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps Mark's mind, starved of oxygen, ravaged by cold and despair, had conjured that final, terrible image. She would never know for sure, and that uncertainty was its own kind of torment. She returned home to the quiet house, a house that now felt even emptier, haunted by the echo of Mark's recorded voice, by the chilling image of his final fear. The world outside her window seemed brighter, louder, more garishly alive than before, yet she felt disconnected from it, a ghost in her own life. She had brought Mark back, in a way. His voice, his last words, were a tangible link, but it wasn't the closure she had hoped for. How could there be closure when his end was so filled with terror, so ambiguous? She had found his ice axe, a symbol of his passion, the tool of his chosen craft, and she had found his voice, a testament to his suffering. The original recording she kept. The authorities had a copy. The small plastic device sat in her bedside drawer, a dark relic. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the silence of the house pressed in on her, she would take it out. She would listen to his voice, to the howling wind, to his descriptions of the whiteout, his dwindling hope. She would listen to his fear. She never listened to the very end anymore. She couldn't bear to hear those final words again, the words that painted such a vivid picture of his ultimate dread. It's not the cold that scares me. It's what's watching me from the ridge. Life eventually had to resume. She went back to work. Friends, seeing that she had done something, that she had made the pilgrimage, began to treat her with a cautious normalcy. They didn't ask about the details of what she found. They sensed, perhaps, that some doors were better left unopened. But for Sarah, the door to that icy pass, to that desolate ridge, would never fully close. The shadow Mark had described became a shadow in her own mind, a persistent, unsettling presence. She would find herself scanning horizons, looking for something out of place, a darkness that didn't belong. She dreamed of vast white landscapes, of a lone figure struggling, and of something watching from just out of sight. She had gone to Everest to find her husband. She had found a piece of him, yes, his final story. But she had also found something else, a chilling echo of the unknown, a glimpse into a terror that lay beyond the rational, beyond the comprehensible. The mountain had taken Mark, but it had left her with his fear, a cold, enduring legacy. The ice axe was eventually returned to her, a grim trophy. She cleaned it carefully, respectfully. She didn't display it. Instead, she wrapped it in a soft cloth and placed it in the back of Mark's old climbing gear cupboard, alongside his ropes and carabiners, his boots that had walked so many miles, now still forever. Sometimes she would open the cupboard and just look at it. The worn metal, the faded tape on the grip. It was a tangible link to his strength, his passion, and his end. It was all she had left of his physical presence on that terrible mountain. The world would remember Mark Anderson as another climber lost to Everest. Sarah would remember him as the man she loved, the man who had faced not only the fury of the world's highest mountain, but also a deeper, more primal fear, a fear that whispered from the edge of perception, from the dark, unseen corners of the wild. She would live with that knowledge, with that shadow, for the rest of her days. The mountain kept its ultimate secrets, but it had shared just enough to ensure she would never truly find peace. His final words would always be there, a haunting refrain in the silence of her life. Did this remind you of something from your own life? Let us know below.